All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Alyssa Kraft, and I'm honored to welcome you all to another program with American Jewish University's Wizen Center for Open Learning. Today's program is a special program to honor Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. The program is in their parents' words. The children of Holocaust survivors share their stories. And I am joined today by the children of Holocaust survivors from the organization, the Shoah Legacy Writers, who will be sharing their parents' stories with us today. As the late Elie Wiesel once said of blessed memory, for the dead and the living, we must bear witness. Today, we are doing just that. These stories passed down, reflected on, and retold by a remarkable group of children of Holocaust survivors. The program that we have today is presented in partnership with Shoah Legacy Writers, as I mentioned before, and I wanted to fill you in on a little bit on what they do. So it's a platform that gives voices to 2Gs, is what it's being called, or second generation, the children of Holocaust survivors who carry the legacy of the Holocaust not as firsthand witnesses, but as the next generation of memory keepers. Today's program will be centered around the theme of the value of small victories. Our speakers will share the extraordinary yet often overlooked moments of resilience, courage, and defiance that helped their parents survive the Holocaust. These small but profound acts, whether a shared piece of bread, a whispered prayer, or a fleeting act of kindness, became the foundation of survival and transformation for victims to heroic survivors. To begin, I'm honored to introduce our first speaker and the organizer of Shoah Legacy Survivors Initiative, Paul Schneider. Paul is the youngest son and nephew of two sisters from Poland who survived the Holocaust in Soviet exile. While they vowed to never speak of it again, over time they were whittled away and luckily shared their story with Paul, and Paul is here to share their story with us today. So thank you all so much for being here. There will be question and answer at the end of the program once all of the stories are told. So as things come up for you, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But without further ado, Paul, please take it away.
Thank you, Alyssa, and welcome to this Yom HaShoah commemoration 2025 on behalf of our group, the Shoah Legacy Writers. I want to acknowledge our founder, Michelle Gold, Honorary Director of the Holocaust Museum of LA, who has taught us so much and has really been instrumental in our work. And I want to acknowledge Priscilla Schneider, who's one of our members, not a relative of mine, but who did help me quite a bit with editing, and I'm grateful to her. I'm Paul Schneider, and I'm very proud to be in the role of introducing our subject tonight and our speakers, all of whom are incredibly valued members of Shoah Legacy Writers. But before I do so, I could not resist the temptation to tell a small story myself, one that I think introduces our theme of the value of small victories. I speak of my mom, Rosa Schneider, born Rosa Filler, who first encountered the Nazis on September the 8th, 1939, as they invaded her town on the Polish-Ukrainian border. She was a child survivor who spent the war in Soviet exile along with her little sister Gittel, both orphaned in Soviet Uzbekistan. Considering that the Holocaust began for them so early and ended at the end of the war, I sometimes think that my mother and her sister had the longest Holocaust because of those factors. The story I'm going to tell begins in 1956, after the war, after she is married, when late in her third pregnancy, she found herself sitting before a doctor, her body as limp as the gown that draped across her shoulders. The obstetrician's eyes peeked out from under his 10-gallon hat. Yes, he really was wearing a 10-gallon hat. And then his eyes peeked back into the chart. He himself was a proud Texan, exiled also to Los Angeles. Mrs. Schneider, when bleeding happens this late in a pregnancy, well, it's no good. I can't really remember a case when I could save the baby. He picked up an old-fashioned stethoscope that attached to his forehead like tefillin, and he began to listen to my mother's abdomen. At that time, medical ultrasound had not yet been invented. As he closed his eyes to listen, my mother also closed her eyes to remember. She remembered back to her home in Sonnet before the war when she was very little. Her brother Gedalia was diagnosed with water on the brain called hydrocephalus, and her mother and father took him to the big city, Krakow, to find a special doctor who could operate. Only in the end, it was too late to operate, and they could not save him. They buried him in Krakow. She remembered when she was in Soviet exile during the war, when her parents had already starved and died, and she and her sister, aged about 13 and 10, both came down with typhus in Siberia. There was no shelter, no food or work, and to get into the hospital, she had to scavenge a few potatoes to try to pay the doctor to treat her. She would always say later in life that if you're going to the doctor, you had better bring a sack of potatoes. She used to say that much as she looked at, she used to say that much as she loved America for giving her a home as an orphan, Americans did not know how to be hungry. She knew how to be hungry, for she knew how to find scraps of food along the roadside or to buy a potato with a penny that she found on the road. What she meant about Americans not knowing how to be hungry was that if you're starving and only have pennies, buy potatoes, not junk food, because you will stay full longer. She knew what it was to run after a stray dog that she could kill when she was starving. She knew what it was to no longer have parents who could provide for her. She remembered also after my brother Harold, who's in the audience today, her first baby was born, naming him after her beloved father Herschel. She remembered when a Catholic nun came to her in the hospital and asked if she could pray for her. My mother had never been in a church and knew nothing of comparative religion. She also had a fear of nuns and priests from the old country, even that they might possibly take Harold away. She had to protect him after already losing everything in her life. She had to protect him to begin again. But she gave in to her better nature and accepted that if the seemingly kind nun said she wanted to pray for her, maybe she really would pray for her. And maybe that would be okay. And it was okay. My mom and the doctor now both opened their eyes and looked straight at each other in the exam room. I'm sorry, Mrs. Schneider, the baby is dead. I will have to take it out tonight. My mom's body, once limp and afraid, rose up and lifted the gown straight by her shoulders. I will come back tomorrow. I have to go home and make dinner for my husband and the kids, Harold and Irene. Caught unawares, the obstetrician was incredulous. At that time, patients did not speak back. Mrs. Schneider, you do not understand. You need to have the operation tonight, or you may die. Doctor, you do not understand. I need to go home and make dinner. Returning the next morning, she again sat in front of an obstetrician, another one this time. He again listened with the stethoscope and this time smiled. I don't know, Mrs. Schneider, the baby is fine. Our family joke is that Diane, who's also in the audience today, was born because my mom went home and made dinner. I came around 7 years later. Why did mom go home against the doctor's advice? She certainly did not suspect that he was medically wrong or have problems recognizing his authority or want to create drama. Mom was not the dramatic type. She never really told us why in so many words, but I believe that at that time in her life, there simply was nothing more important than being a good wife and mother, even more so than her own life. Her life was, her act was a redemption of a once ruined life, now reborn after the Shoah and put to purpose, the purpose of recreating a family. Was my mom's act truly redemptive? Maybe it was just good luck or fear, or maybe she just felt like cooking. No, I think it came from somewhere deep inside, so deep that she couldn't tell the doctor or us what or why in words. In fact, I think she was undoing the extermination of herself and her family. Such was my mom, a very smart, intuitive, and kind woman. and such was her role in transitioning her life from victim to survivor. As such, she had a role in our family that was bigger than herself. She was almost mythic and very much loved by all who knew her. And that is just the first of the stories we're here to share on this very important day, Yom HaShoah. Four of my colleagues who will share stories of their parents and the value of small victories in their lives. Each of these victories, while small in appearance, was actually a huge step forward in the recovery of the survivors and to their children, the second generation. And therein lies the paradox of today's conference: small victories, huge victories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your mother's story and for introducing this program to our viewers. So thank you so much for that. Next up in order, we will have Aviyah Farkas sharing, Debbie Beckman sharing, Fern Topas Salka sharing, and finally Ellie Eldon sharing. So first up is Aviyah Farkas. Born in 1948, Aviyah was deeply shaped by World War II. Her Jewish father survived the Holocaust with help from her Christian mother. Aviyah published the award-winning book, Overcoming Deepest Grief, A Woman's Journey. Today, she will be sharing My Father, Kalman Gutlan, Transformed from a Victim to a Heroic Survivor. Aviyah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Holocaust survivors all have incredible, often unbelievable stories at which people shake their heads and marvel. My father's story of survival are also unbelievable. This lack of belief in the things that my father survived dogged him throughout his post-Holocaust life. At the end of my father's Shoah testimony, which he gave 7 months before he died in 1986, he was asked, "Did you talk about your Holocaust experience to anyone?" He reluctantly replied, "No, not too widely. All of my escapes and escapades, even to me, I used to feel that people wouldn't believe me. I must emphasize that it was number 1, luck, number 2, luck, number 3, taking chances, number 4, when you take chances, you have luck." Kalman Gutlan, my barely 5'3" soft-spoken, mild-mannered father, survived things which are difficult to believe. He was a man who believed in himself, a man who quickly sized up situations and trusted his gut instincts. My father had such faith in the fact that he would live, would survive the horrible, unspeakable events, that he took unbelievable chances. Maybe taking chances was his way of resisting the enemies of Jews. Maybe it was take chances or die. In a letter telling me some of his experiences during the Holocaust, he writes, "I had a secret hope, should I say knowledge, that I will survive all these bastards who were my enemies and the enemies of progress." My father was born in 1910. He grew up in Budapest, became a banker in his 20s, married my Christian American mother in 1939, was fired from his job because of anti-Jewish laws, and along with approximately 100,000 other Hungarian men, was taken into forced labor in 1941. His labor company, the 10936, was sent to toil in the Carpathian Mountains, putting up telegraph lines. Amongst the many brutal conditions of forced labor, the men were not issued uniforms and had to find their own shelter. When the mountain weather became dangerously frigid, my mother's Jewish employer, Paul Totis, was instrumental in saving the 200 men of my father's labor company by bribing army officials to have the men move back to Budapest, where they now labored in the Goldberger textile factory. Men in forced labor would be given a 3-hour leave each 6 to 8 weeks. Being back in Budapest, they were close enough to visit their families. My mother could now give my father warm clothing, good food, and they even made my oldest sister, Victoria, named for Allied victory. Had the men stayed in the Carpathian Mountains, they would have frozen to death. When the Germans invaded Hungary in March 1944, Paul Totis once again had the labor company moved from Budapest to the industrial area near Miskolc, believing they would be safer outside of the capital. There they were put to work in the Hungarian railroad foundry without proper gloves or shoes to handle the red-hot iron ore. When the Allies began their bombing raids in Axis industrial areas, the men were now tasked with clearing the streets of rubble and dead bodies. On October 15, 1944, with the Szálasi Arrow Cross coup, Admiral Horthy's reign as leader of Hungary ended. The Christian commander of my father's labor company told the men, "Just go home." It was clear that Hungary was finished. The Russians had already entered eastern Hungarian cities and were on their way to liberate Budapest. For the men to just go home meant that they had to cross the Bükk Mountains in late October, early November, when it rained nonstop and Arrow Cross terrorists were on the road actively searching for Jews. After 3 weeks of little food, constant rain and cold, traveling at night, hiding by day, the men made it back to the outskirts of Budapest and separated. It was safer not to stay together as a band of recognizable Jewish slave laborers. My father took off his yellow forced labor armband, carefully got onto the trolley so as not to be noticed, and made it to his family's apartment in Budapest. There, my mother stayed with my infant sister, Victoria. My paternal grandmother had already been forced to enter the Budapest ghetto. My father spent one night with my mother, and in the early morning hours, he was picked up by Arrow Cross militants who were conducting door-to-door patrols looking for Jews to take for deportation. In Budapest in early November 1944, approximately 200,000 Hungarian Jews still survived, a nice gift for Hitler. The Arrow Cross patrols marched the Budapest Jews to a brick factory on the Buda side of the Danube. There my father was gathered along with the hundreds of others taken at gunpoint by the Arrow Cross. Inside the brick factory was total chaos. People stood in utter confusion and shock in the pouring rain and thick ankle-deep mud. Families sought shelter, tired, hungry, forlorn, and miserable. Women holding their children's hands screamed out that they were Christians, then summarily shot. Instead of being packed onto cattle cars as transport, they were marched out by the thousands along the main highway leading to the Austrian border, having to walk the nearly 110 miles without proper shoes, clothing, food, or shelter. After my father was taken, my mother went on an anguished search for him. She learned which route the prisoners would take, and in desperation followed them, trying to find my father. In her post-war journal, she writes, "We saw the long column of deportees, exhausted, rain-soaked, hungry, sleep-deprived people trudging along. Old women, young girls, pregnant women, old men, and men dragging themselves in their long, long cavalry to an unknown fate. It was a wretched sight. Heart-wrenching, pale faces stared at us as we called the names of the people we were looking for. My mother never found my father amongst those destined for death. She had no idea that my father had been able to escape from the brick factory. Once he arrived there, amongst the chaos, the mud, the utter confusion, my father knew in his gut that he would get out. He writes, "If ever this was an hour of taking chances or perish." I approached a middle-aged, benevolent-looking Hungarian guard and asked him to transfer me to my unit from where I had inadvertently strayed. I was lucky. The man was understanding. Of course, he saw through my scheme, but in the confusion, he stuck the bayonet on his rifle and marched me out from the brick factory through the gates of hell. A half hour later, the two of us were warming our frozen limbs in a friendly tavern, sipping hot wine toddy. From there, my father was able to obtain a Karl Lutz Schutzbrief safe pass and was able to enter a safe house. In this safe house, he had another unbelievably narrow escape, which I cannot tell you about now, but I want you to know how lucky I am to have had a father who believed in himself, who followed his gut, who took unbelievable chances, and who had number one, luck, number two, luck, number three, he took chances, and number four, had luck taking chances.
Aviyah, thank you so much for sharing your mother and father's story. Once again, to the audience, if you have questions for any of our speakers today, please put them in the Q&A function below. Next up, we have Debbie Beckman. Both Debbie Beckman's parents were Holocaust survivors. They were born in small neighboring rural villages in Czechoslovakia. Since 2016, Debbie has been involved with the Holocaust Museum LA as a docent, volunteer, and part-time employee. Today, Debbie presents Small Victories of Survival in Memory of My Parents. Debbie, thank you.
Survival is the biggest victory for Holocaust survivors, with many small victories along the way. Mom was much more open and verbal about her survival, discussing the horrors, fears, and atrocities she witnessed and experienced firsthand. Dad, on the other hand, was silent and much more reserved since the scars of the war and his experiences ran deep. They have never fully healed from their experiences and personal losses. Mom endured and survived a ghetto and 5 concentration camps, while Dad endured and survived several forced labor battalions. As a docent at the Holocaust Museum LA, I often explain that Mom's survival can be attributed to her will to live, being in the right place at the right time, making the right decision at the right time, faith, common sense, sheer luck, and she was young and strong. Dad's survival can be attributed to his faith and his yearning to be reunited with his family, in addition to him being an extremely physically strong man. They both lived with PTSD, a mental health condition that arises from extremely stressful and/or terrifying events. Small victories. Prior to Mom's deportation in a cattle call to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland, her father imparted a crucial message. He said to her that he and her mother would not return, but she would. She carried his words and voice with her throughout her experiences, which provided the strength and resolve needed to persevere and ultimately survive. Factors such as luck and an unwavering will to live played a significant role in her survival. Upon her arrival in Auschwitz, Mom was selected to join a group of able-bodied women, while other women were directed elsewhere to go to the gas chambers. This selection provided Mom with the chance to survive, purely luck. During her time in Auschwitz, Mom left the barracks every morning to work, regardless of how she felt, as those who remained behind would never be seen or heard from again. Her determination to survive, coupled with common sense and her ability to make the right decisions at critical moments, was paramount. In Auschwitz, Mom developed an illness and was sent to the concentration camp hospital. While Mom was in the hospital, Adolf Eichmann walked in and told the women to stand up, strip down naked, and then line up in 2 rows within the hospital ward. Of the approximate 300 women lined up in the hospital, Eichmann selected 3 women to go back to their barracks. Mom was one of them. The remaining women were led into special vans where they were murdered. These women were gassed with carbon monoxide from the specially equipped Red Cross gas chamber vans. These specialized vans were commonly referred to as Sonderwagen, Spieselwagen, or Endloswagen, excuse my pronunciation. When Mom went back to her barracks, others warned if she was a ghost, as very few prisoners survived the hospital. This was purely random luck. During Mom's time in the Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany, she developed an unbearable earache from the severe cold and biting wind. She was sent to the hospital and the staff treated her ear and she was released. Afterwards, she suffered an unprovoked beating by a German guard to the side of her head. This beating caused her ear wound to open. This injury caused pus to ooze from her ear, and then Mom squeezed out more pus from the infected area, which she believed led to her ear to heal. Again, examples of luck, Mom's will to live, and common sense. During Mom's internment in Ravensbrück, she worked in a basement loading vegetables on trucks for the SS. She was able to very carefully eat a little piece of a vegetable now and then for a few weeks. Mom had to be extremely careful not to be caught. If she was caught, she would have been punished, which most likely would have been death. Again, examples of luck, Mom's will to live, making the right decision at the right time, and being in the right place at the right time. Mom was then deported to the Leitmeritz concentration camp outside Poland and Germany. From Leitmeritz, Mom was forced on a death march to the Theresienstadt concentration camp in German-occupied Czechoslovakia. This march took place a few days and was only at nighttime. Mom did not have shoes, but was extremely lucky that a woman had given her rags and ties. Mom was able to tie these rags to her feet to provide some protection from the snow, but her feet still suffered nerve damage caused by frostbite, which resulted in chronic foot pain for the rest of her life. The prospect of possibly losing her feet deeply distressed and depressed her, and upon learning this, I was equally horrified. Luck that someone in the camp gave her the rags. Mom was liberated from Theresienstadt by Russian soldiers on May 8, 1945, ironically the day Germany surrendered. The camp survivors asked the liberating Russian soldiers for food, and the Russian soldiers responded they were hungry as well, and told the survivors to go down a road to where the Germans had abandoned their homes and the camp survivors could take anything they wanted. Many survivors got extremely sick and in some instances died from refeeding syndrome, which is a condition that occurs when people who have been starving are reintroduced to food too quickly. Luckily, Mom ate only bread and raw potatoes. Again, examples of luck, being in the right place at the right time and making the right decision at the right time. Also, Mom was gifted with common sense. Dad was a young and physically strong individual, which contributed to his survival in the labor battalions. It was fortunate that he possessed such genetics. Dad was sustained by the hope of reuniting with his father, wife, and 3 children. He attributed his survival to both fortunate circumstances and a strong will to live. After liberation, he went home, only to discover that his family had been murdered in Auschwitz. My parents met shortly after they were liberated and were married in November 1945. Recognizing the impending governance by communism, they made the decision to leave. They left their small rural farm villages in Czechoslovakia and made their way to Prague, their city of departure to the United States. During their journey to Prague, they crossed European borders illegally without documentation, often having to evade border guards, and my sister was born along the way. Their successful immigration to the United States was due to their timely and prudent decisions, as well as a measure of good fortune, including luck, making the right decisions at the right time, and common sense. Major victories. Mom would show her Auschwitz arm tattoo, the letter A 7922, to everyone. I believe this was her way of showing that she survived and provided her with a sense of victory. In November 9, excuse me, In November 1948, my parents arrived in the United States and initially stayed with Dad's sister in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was born. After a few months, along with my 2-year-old sister, we traveled by train to Los Angeles, where my brother was born. My parents arrived in Los Angeles, where they reconnected with family members who had settled there before or arrived after the Holocaust. They secured housing and later purchased a home. Dad obtained employment and eventually established a shoe repair business on Fairfax Avenue for over 20 years. Mom worked alongside him, contributing to his specialty in crafting orthopedic shoes. My parents created a nurturing and loving environment for our family. They were diligent in their efforts, ensuring that all our needs were met. My parents were extremely protective of myself and my siblings. We always had delicious old school Eastern European meals. My mother was the best cook, and we enjoyed family dinners together every evening. My parents maintained their religious practices. Their faith provided them with the strength to endure and persevere. They attended synagogue, observed holidays and the Jewish Sabbath every Saturday, which is a day for prayer, reflection, and rest. They also enrolled us in Hebrew school. In conclusion, additional major victories. My parents endured the Holocaust and ultimately created a loving family. They had 3 children, 2 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. Their courageous survival is the reason for our existence. I am honored and grateful to be part of their legacy and to share their stories with future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. And Maggie, can you turn to the next slide? And it has, there we go, Debbie's parents right there. And then is grandchildren and great-grandchildren, correct? At the bottom?
Yes, their granddaughter, my daughter Marlene, and her husband Mark, and their younger grandson Jake, and their older grandson Ben, who was graduating college.
Beautiful, a beautiful family. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Thank you. This is their legacy.
Yeah, a beautiful legacy. Next up, we have Fern Topas Salka, who will be sharing the story of her parents. Fern Topas Salka's parents married before the war, lived in and escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto, lived in and survived living in a wall, then a sewer, then enslavement on a German pig farm. Today, Fern shares her parents' story. It's called Celebration. Fern, thank you.
Thank you. My story takes place considerably after the war and begins when I was in junior high. So it's a little different timing and a different feel. It was such a little thing, really. All I did was get a good grade in my history class, but everything in my house was celebrated. So I knew that small as my victory was, my father would make a big deal out of it. Armed with my paper about the stamp tax with its bright red A on top, I anxiously awaited for my father to come home. His evening schedule was relatively predictable. He often worked 12-hour days, but he rarely failed to return home promptly at 6:30 each evening to share dinner with my mother and me, returning to work again only after he had helped me with my homework. He would enter our second-floor apartment after bounding up the single flight of stairs and announce his entry with a light cough, which was a leftover from his many years as a smoker. He would fling open the front door, rarely locked at that time, and call out like Ward Cleaver, "I'm home." My mother, who prized the order and cleanliness of her domain, particularly her new beige carpet, would respond, "Shoes." My dad would take off his shoes and then line them up by the door, Japanese style. Then he would proceed to remove other pieces of his clothing, calling out in crisp military fashion, "Socks, pants, shirt." And off they would come, to be neatly hung up on my mother and replaced by boxer shorts and a sleeveless t-shirt. When something good happened at school during the day, no matter how tiny the event, I would proudly announce it at the conclusion of this homecoming dance. The choreography that followed was equally predictable. "Let's celebrate," my dad would exclaim. And my mother would continue the routine by making hors d'oeuvres out of Ritz crackers, topped with bits of cheese and pickles, pouring cocktails of juice and seltzer, sprayed from an old-fashioned spritzer glass bottle and served in martini glasses with 2 or 3 large stuffed green olives in each. The fact that there were only 3 of us didn't diminish the celebration, even for holiday dinners. On those special events for which most other families had guests consisting of immediate and extended family, the trio of us, dressed in our fancy clothes, took out the good dishes and shared the events in our own good company. Sometimes we invited friends whose company came to feel like family, but I do not recall being disturbed or disheartened when we were only a threesome. It's quite incredible, though, that my father and my mother could have been so joyous so often. When I was born, my father was just 8 years removed from the September day in 1939 when he responded to the German bombing of Warsaw by joining a stream of citizens in marching about 200 miles to the north to the Russian territories, taking with him only what he could carry on his back. He was just 7 years removed from the Warsaw Ghetto, to which he returned when the Russians said that the Jews were no longer welcome. 7 years from the typhoid and the bombing afflicting his hometown. He was just 6 years removed from the hole in the wall where he crouched whenever anyone entered the attic apartment where my mother lived, ostensibly as a single Christian woman. From the place where he, a small, dark-haired, dark-eyed, large-beaked Jew, sat silently for over a year, lest a neighbor hear him speak or walk or even sneeze. He was just 4 years removed from the sewer in which he lived for 18 months, from the hot, dank bunker he and 31 other Jews built under the abandoned city of Warsaw, from the terrible pangs of constant hunger to the terror of being caught during his nightly food raids through the nearly deserted city. 2 years from the ship that carried him and my mother to this country with no money, almost no surviving family, and minimal knowledge of the English language. Even after he and my mother became more settled in the United States, life was difficult. The hours were long and the money was slow. Trained as a scientist, he was unable to get work in his field until he mastered the language and the culture. And an immigrant doing manual labor is not only short on money, but respect as well. Even when better opportunities began to come his way, he was in a desperate race to succeed in the remaining few years he felt he could be productive. So he began his days early and ended them late. But celebrate he did every day in a multitude of ways. Starting in the morning, 6 days a week, every week, with no vacations for years, he arose at 6 a.m., showered quickly, and shaved as the morning light came up, lathered his face with a short-handled bristle brush, and removed the soap and whiskers with efficient strokes of his hand-held Gillette. He emerged from his tiny bathroom, ruddy face from his ministrations, brown eyes, clear and bright, straight black hair, slick with water, brushed back, leaving 2 deep V's in the front. Before you saw him, though, you heard his signature morning call, a strong, tuneful, whistling rendition of songs from this week's Your Hit Parade. If he met you in the hall and he liked you a lot, and he liked me a lot, he'd give another signature mark, a pinch of the cheek, a quick movement, a stinging tweak, and an affectionate glance. On Sundays, he slept in. As a little child, I lay quietly in my bed on these mornings, waiting to hear the sounds that meant he was awake. A few seconds later, he would shout, "Playtime!" And I would bound out of my room and fly into the twin beds pushed together that he and my mother shared. We would talk and joke, and he would tickle me, and she would kiss me up. The days ended too with a pause for loving. I swear I was nearly married before he stopped singing Brahms' lullaby to me at night, standing near my bed as I closed my eyes on the day. He didn't look as joyful as he was. By nature, his face was stern-looking in repose, and he rarely made a sound when he laughed, another remnant of his days in hiding. His demeanor sometimes scared my friends, but to me, he was a jolly soul who would shake his large pot-belly up and down when he laughed, turning red in the face and teary in the eyes. Once he silently laughed so hard at a Sid Caesar show that he fainted dead away on the floor. He loved good comedians, and he loved making jokes himself. He would wiggle his ears when he was telling you something serious, but he wouldn't acknowledge he was doing it, and you weren't quite sure it had even happened. He would lift one eyebrow at a time and punctuate his sentences with his contortions. My best friend still vividly remembers my somewhat formal father, who wore suits to the beach, leaping into the living room in a grand jeté, spindly arms outstretched and slight legs in the air, clad only in his boxer shorts and the Italian-style sleeveless shirt, which stretched over his surprisingly large and round midsection. Wordless, he bowed and departed. Although our home was filled with much laughter, maintaining joy took an exercise of will. Once, when my father was telling me a story about a favorite niece of his, whom he had obviously loved dearly, but who was gassed by the Nazis when she was 11, I asked him how he could be so dispassionate about the tale of her death. On one of the very few occasions when I saw him cry, his voice cracked as he said, "If I let myself feel what had happened, I would go crazy. I just stand above the stories and tell them like it's just history." He then put his head down on the table where he sat and sobbed. It was at that moment that I first understood the resilience and courage it took my parents to live lives that included humor, celebration, and joy, and that this willingness and ability to do that was no small victory.
Thank you, Fern, for sharing your parents' story. Last up, but certainly not least, Ellie Eldon. Ellie Eldon's father, Shaul, joined the Polish army at 17 and was wounded while fighting the Nazi Germans during their invasion of Poland. Escaping to the Soviet Union, he was detained and sent to Pechora Gulag in Siberia. And when he returned home after the war, he discovered that most of his family had been killed. Ellie will close out this portion of our program with a meaningful resistance. Q&A to follow.
The Jewish Talmud is the collection of centuries of Jewish oral law that has followed the teachings of the Jewish written law, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible. A section of the Talmud called Tract Sanhedrin describes in detail the practice of witness testimony in court proceedings. The Talmud states that he who saves a human being is regarded as if he has saved a whole world. The Talmud explains that statement by referring to the biblical story of Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis. When God asks Cain about the whereabouts of his brother Abel, Cain responds, "Am I my brother's keeper?" To which God proclaims, "The bloods of your brother are shouting to me from the ground." The bloods of your brother, blood in plural. Why does God use the plural bloods to describe the killing of one human being? The Talmud further explains that by killing Abel, Cain had not only destroyed his own brother. By killing Abel, Cain has destroyed the entire future lineage of descendants that would have come from Abel. He had destroyed a whole humanity of people, a whole world. By helping others to be saved and by saving themselves from the horrors of destruction, our parents and those who came out of the abyss have saved the whole world, the offspring of those who were saved. In the small victories of living to see another day, they saw a meaning. For them, a meaningful resistance in the face of evil has been to survive and to give the gift of life to new generations. The stories of my parents had originated in the vibrant rural Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. Situated 50 miles north of Majdanek and 50 miles south of Treblinka, the town of Lukov, Poland was the birthplace of my father Shaul. In an area that would become the epicenter of what the Nazi German had called Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question. In a remote part of northern Romania, the town of Strojinec was the birthplace of my mother Lily. In an area that would become the scene of one of the largest scale organized destructions of Jewish lives perpetrated by a host nation against its own Jewish population during the Holocaust. Romania ranks first among Holocaust perpetrator countries other than Nazi Germany. A singular historical event had been detrimental to the stories of both of my parents, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact that was signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on August 23, 1939. The two nations had agreed not to attack one another and in a secret protocol had agreed to divide Poland, Romania, and other countries to spheres of influence between them. Poland was to be divided between the two. It was also stipulated that Germany would not interfere with the Soviet Union's actions toward northern Romania. My father had joined the Polish army at the age of 17, and when the war broke out, he was in western Poland near the border with Germany, a soldier fighting the Nazi Germans as they invaded Poland. Having been wounded by German fire, he had returned to his hometown of Lukov. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Red Army launched an invasion of Poland from the east. Several days later, the Soviets entered Lukov. On September 28, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a second supplemental protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact called German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty. This second protocol stipulated that the demarcation line between Nazi German-occupied Poland and Soviet-occupied Poland is moved to the east, from the Sun River to the Bug River. So at a stroke of a pen, Lukov had moved from the Soviet-occupied zone to the Nazi German-occupied zone. The Soviet army had retreated from Lukov on that same day. During this short window of about a week of Soviet occupation, a group of 300 Jews, mostly young men, were allowed by the Soviets to board a train that would take them to Brest-Litovsk, a city on the Polish-Soviet border. The Jews in this group were by and large the only survivors from the Jewish community of Lukov. My father was one of them. Following the Aviyah Conference in 1938 and to deter Jewish refugees in Europe from heading east toward the Soviet Union, Stalin, the ruler of the Soviet Union, gave an order that anyone who tried to cross the border into the Soviet Union would be considered a spy. So as my father crossed the border into the Soviet Union, he had been detained and sent to the Pechora Gulag in Siberia. In northern Romania, when the war broke out, the Soviets had given an ultimatum to the Romanian government to transfer control of northern regions of Romania to the Soviets. The Romanian government agreed to withdraw from the territories to avoid a military conflict. The Soviet army had marched into Strojinec, where my mother's family had lived. During the Soviet occupation that lasted 1 year, young Jewish men had joined the Soviet army to fight the Nazi Germans. Among those who had joined the fight were 3 of my uncles. The 3 of them were killed on the battlefields of the Eastern Front. Back in Poland, my paternal family had been largely destroyed by the Nazi Germans in the gas chambers of Treblinka and Majdanek and at the Miedzierżec ghetto. In northern Romania, the Soviet occupation had ended after 1 year. The area where my maternal family had lived had been reoccupied by Romania as part of Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. In Romania at the time, a new fascist regime came to power that was fully aligned with the Nazi regime and its ideology. Driven by anti-Semitism that was deeply rooted in Romania and the full adoption of Nazi ideology, the Romanians had accused the Jews that were under Soviet occupation of being collaborators. The Romanian regime then embarked on a brutal campaign of destroying the Jewish communities of northern Romania. Some of the Jews were destroyed in their communities. Others, such as my mother's family, had been deported to Transnistria. Many perished on the way. The remaining family ended up at the Bershad ghetto, where over the course of months and years, my maternal family had been largely destroyed by disease, freezing, and starvation. At the end of the war, my father had returned from the Soviet Gulag to his hometown in Poland and found out that his family had been largely destroyed. He proceeded to a displaced person camp near Heidelberg, Germany, and from there to a port near Genoa, Italy, where he boarded a ship to pre-statehood Israel. The ship had been stopped on the way by the British Navy, and all on board were moved to a detention camp in Cyprus. My mother, together with a few survivors from her family, had been liberated by the Soviet army that conquered Transnistria. Later on, they would board a ship out of Europe in Constanța, Romania. Rising from the ashes of death and destruction, Shaul and Lily chose life. They got married in Israel in 1953 and gave the gift of life to my brother Dov and I. We grew up insulated from the history of our family. When my parents wanted to talk about the past, they would speak in Yiddish so that we, the kids, would not understand. It is 1994. My mother passed away years before. The stories about our family had been revealed to us by my father shortly before he passed away. It would take years of assembling the pieces of the stories, documenting the lives lost, and eventually coming to terms with the loss and the memories, culminating in putting it all in writing as part of the Shoah Legacy Writers group at the Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles.
Ellie, thank you so much. That is the culmination of stories shared for today. And I do want to make time for some questions as we have about 7 minutes to do so. There was one question for each of you to answer, and that was for each of the survivor children, did your parents attribute their luck to religious faith or strictly to luck alone? And we'll go in order, start with Paul. Paul, we'll start with you.
Well, no, my mother did not attribute any of her survival to religious faith. As a matter of fact, personally, she felt that she had been abandoned by God and had what I would call a crisis of faith about it that persisted for many, many years. That was extensive enough to actually discourage much religious interest in the children. So I would say for my mom, it was the reverse effect.
Thank you for sharing. Aviyah?
My father was a purely secular Jew, and he attributed his survival to pure luck.
Sure. Debbie, how about for your parents?
Well, both my parents were from very religious Orthodox families, and they maintained their faith through their experiences and after they were liberated, and it was always a very important part of their life. And also, as we always say, a lot of luck, a lot of making the right decisions, a lot of common sense involved.
Sure. Fern, how about for your family?
My parents came from Warsaw. They were secular, quite urbane, and not religious at all in Poland. Though my father's much older brother and his family were and remain the survivors remain extremely religious. My family was irreligious to the point of, I mean, they didn't join synagogue, or they weren't interested at all, and they felt less religious, that less inclination to even entertain the subject of religion. I am also not, I don't consider myself a person who's a God believer, but I'm much more involved in synagogue life and traditional Jewish learning and so forth than my family was, my parents were.
Sure.
And they attributed it to making right decisions and having common sense, you know, as Debbie said, but also mainly they were lucky. There were a lot of plenty smart people and they died.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And Ellie, how about for your parents?
I would say that it sort of differs between my mom and dad. My mother came from a deeply religious family. Her mother came from a very important Hasidic city called Sadigora. So they were immersed in religion. She kept her faith very deeply throughout the years. My father went as a young boy to the Cheder. He went through the standard teaching of a Jewish kid, but over years he sort of drifted a little bit, I would say. But still, both of them maintained their strong connection to the Jewish people as their, I would say, primary fundamental faith, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And then we'll do one more question before we unfortunately have to end this program. Mark asks, and once again, each and every one of you will go in the same order. Paul, we'll start with you. What is your first memory that your parents were Holocaust survivors?
Oh, that's really interesting, considering I haven't thought about that. I would say in the beginning with my mom, it was only that my mom had survived something called the war, and it was left as generic as that, and that she was to be respected for being someone who had survived the war. Yeah. And it was only much later in my life that I really began to pick it out of her, that she shared with me the Holocaust details. As you mentioned in your intro, my mom had vowed to her sister to never talk about this to their children, and that we would be shielded from it to protect us. But yeah, my first memories were just very broad, and mom is some kind of war survivor.
Aviyah?
Well, I grew up somehow always knowing that my parents had survived, for my mother surviving the war and my father surviving the Holocaust. And in my family, there was a picture of the 3 Allied soldiers wringing the neck of a vulture with the swastika at the bottom of the vulture's feet. So this gruesome photo was always in my childhood home.
Very interesting. Thank you. And Debbie, how about for you?
Yes, since a young child, my mother was very verbal about her experiences. So I don't remember what she told me first, but I knew her experiences and learned more as time went on. I didn't know much about my father's experiences. He was very silent. I only heard about his loss of his wife and 3 children by overhearing a telephone conversation of my mother with a friend, and I was a teenager at the time. And that's the first I heard anything about my father's experiences.
Wow, that must have been shocking. Did
Yes.
you immediately ask him about it, or?
No, he obviously did not want to talk about it. I just want to throw this in. I am very grateful to Steven Spielberg and the Shoah Foundation, because I had them come out and interview both my parents. And I learned things about both of them, especially my father, that I didn't know. So I'm very grateful to have those interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. No, they're fantastic work over there, especially with other 2Gs, 3Gs, and now 4Gs through Living Links.
Yes.
They're doing
Yes.
fabulous work. No, thank you. Fern, how about for you?
I don't remember a time I didn't know. It was just part of my life. You know, words like liquidation were part of the conversation. All of their friends were Holocaust survivors, and they all talked about it. They told stories. Mainly, I don't know how much I knew about what it meant. I mean, I remember when I was 5 meeting somebody who had an accent and she sounded like my mother. And that was to me what the stories were about. And I don't think I understood until even this day. I still try and figure out. I can't quite get what happened exactly. It's taken me forever to put together some sort of a chronology. I'm not sure I have it entirely right. I couldn't understand, what does it mean that you live in a wall? Or what does it mean to live in a sewer? So I watch movies to try and get it, to try and feel it, to read it. It's kind of like a moth to a flame. And I too, my mom was interviewed by the Shoah Foundation, and I really did. By the time she did that, I knew everything she said, except I hadn't known that she was raped. And I asked her, why didn't you tell me that? You told me everything. And she told me she didn't want to ruin sex for me. So that was very nice of her. And that's the only thing I didn't know.
Wow, very interesting. Thank you. And finally, Ellie, how about for you?
Well, as a little child, I remember one sentence in Yiddish. This is something that always echoed in my mind. And it goes in Yiddish like this: Red Yiddish soll de Kinder nicht verstehen, which means, literally, speak in Yiddish so that the kids would not understand. And this was the culture we grew in. It was a total taboo to talk with the kids about the Holocaust. I didn't know anything at all until I was 36 years old, the year my father passed away in 1994. 3 months before he passed away, he sat down with me and started telling me the stories. I was completely shocked. From there on, I started a journey that lasted, I would say, until today, of researching, collecting all the names. There were so many names of relatives and family members that were killed in the Holocaust. So it became some sort of a life mission and journey, and we are continuing this as part of this wonderful group.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I wish we could talk for another hour about your parents' stories, but unfortunately we do have to say goodbye. But thank you all. Thanks to the audience for joining us today for this important program on Yom HaShoah and bearing witness to the stories of survival through the lens of the children of survivors, through the lens of the Shoah Legacy Writers. And thank you to all of you, to Paul, Aviyah, Debbie, Fern, Ellie, thank you for keeping the memory of your parents alive through these important retellings. Now, to the audience, if you would like to be a participant in the Shoah Legacy Writers or learn more or be a part of this community, I suggest that you go to the link, which is in the chat, which will take you to a webpage for Holocaust Museum LA for 2Gs. Shoah Legacy Writers is working on a webpage, but it won't be live until May. So that'll be your best link for now. But definitely check that out if you want to be involved. And also, if you would like to donate to AJU Open, please note that all of these free webinars are made possible by donors like you. So if you'd like to give a gift to AJU Open to keep these kinds of opportunities going, please click the link in the chat as well. We hope to see you all on another AJU Open program in the future. Please visit us at open.aju.edu to register today. Lahitra Oates, we will see you next time. And once again, thank you so much to the Shoah Legacy Writers.